I wanted to do that. I wanted to put on shows like locally as well. So it's like I basically just kept adding to my plate as long as it felt like there was some connective tissue I could pull together where it's like, okay, me booking local shows could potentially help my band, could potentially, be able to meet other bands where I could obviously trade shows. And so I felt that snowball effect. Like as long as there was that, like I said, connective tissue being able to pull together, and so the interviewing and writing for zines, it just, to me, it felt like the most logical extension where I was like, because I was doing that while I was also playing in bands and reviewing music. And like, I just was always enamored by getting more deeply connected to this music scene. And so I always felt the need to do as much as I possibly could. It's not even so much from a fact of like, oh, my legacy or like the fact that there's more visibility on me as a person. I just like, I could never say no to an interesting opportunity or pursue an interesting opportunity. And so a lot of the things that I've been able to participate in have really not because someone's tapped me on the shoulder, be like, hey, Ray, like, would you, it's usually been me kind of like putting my foot in the door and being like, hey, have you thought about that? Have you thought about doing something like that? And people will be like, oh, actually, no, that's a good idea. Like, do you want to be involved in some capacity? I'm like, yeah, that's kind of why I brought it up. So here's this idea I had. And so I think that was really, the podcast was just kind of like a logical stepping stone in regards to the fact that like the technology exists, the format exists. And that once I became enamored with the idea of podcasts, I was like, oh, I gotta do something in relation to this with the music scene, broadly speaking, because there's no representation at that particular point. Like no one was doing that sort of critical, conversation, like anything in relation to punk or hardcore. So I was like, oh, here's a space that I think I can fill. And whether or not this is something long lasting or just fleeting, I don't care. I'm just going to, again, put my foot in the door and be like, oh, I'll just try this out and then see how it goes.
Yeah, and there really was no one doing it. Like, it's like before, it's like, oh, like here's an interview with a band. How's your record? Or here's your review. But
Yeah.
this is totally different. I want to push further on that though. Doing a podcast is one thing because you're in the conversation. It's like, oh, that's Ray. Like when I read a review for a record, I'm not like, oh, who reviewed this? Like, and I want to know about them. Or if someone does an interview, like a written interview, I'm not like, wow, I'm really interested in knowing about that person. Writing a review is hard work.
Yeah.
And you're really trying to like give a fair review of something, like a fair shake. It's taking someone's creative output for a year or two, and not just the music, it's the recording, it's the art, everything, and like giving yourself to it.
Yeah.
And then doing an interview is like hard, and you have to write it down and do all this stuff. So why that? It's like, I don't want to say totally thankless, but you're like relatively anonymous when you're doing that, but you're telling someone else's story and critiquing someone else's art. Why were you compelled to put yourself in that position? Was it because you thought you were good at it, or it was just like, that's just what I'm going to do?
I honestly, I felt a compulsion partially because I do, from like a schooling perspective, it was relatively easy for me to put pen to paper as far as writing anything at school. And I knew that once I became like, to not push back or contradict what you're saying, but it's like I became obsessed with where it's like, oh, like who's behind antimatter? It's like, oh, it's Norm Arenas. Or it's like, oh, Rumpshaker fanzine, where it's like, oh yeah, Eric Rumpshaker. Like I got to know these zine publishers or whatever. And I use very big air quotes, publishers, So I wanted to create relationships with these people. And then by default, they saw how interested and passionate I was about, writing hardcore, punk, whatever. And so they were just like, oh yeah, it would be as simple as sending me these CDs where I was just like, I'm getting free music on top of, like, this is cool. And you're paying me $20 or whatever. It's like, this is great. So I really never asked myself why. It was just once I became friends with these people, because I was just punishing them about loving their thing, they saw that, oh, I could, potentially, capitalize on this love and be able to get some free stuff out of this. Not joking aside, I just felt so compelled to be involved because I also liked just the organizational aspect of like putting together year-end lists, like all of these things that really scratched an itch as far as like the only childness of me being like, oh man, I gotta, like collect all these football cards or basketball cards or whatever. It's like just that element of like collecting these things and organizing. And again, the context, like, of course, I wouldn't have been able to articulate that when I was 9 years old or whatever. But all of that was important to me. And so, regardless again of whether or not I was getting, the highlight of being like, oh, this is a Ray Harkins piece. So, of course, this is going to be great. I'm like, I didn't care. But as long as a person read it and obviously felt some connective tissue being pulled there, they would be like, oh, that was like a good zine. Like that was a good interview. That's all I could really ask for.
I didn't feel you were pushing back at all. I love what you just said. And so I'm going to put an and on there. It's like, let's think of Dan, Second Nature fanzine.
Yes.
Right? Like unbelievable fanzine.
Unbelievable.
Let's think of Norm, right? Antimatter, unbelievable fanzine. Let's think of Eric, Rumpshaker, unbelievable fanzine. These are like iconic fanzines.
Yep.
And for every one of those, there's like 100 that you've never heard of that people put equal, if not more work into, blood, sweat, and tears. And like zine culture, interview culture, review culture, it's like, it's such a interesting thing because it's like all of this effort, where is it going? It's going to end up in some like, some zine library somewhere and some stack in someone's thing, or like maybe in the garbage. And there's all these voices that are like burning so bright that then kind of disappear, right? And zines and interviews and reviews, it's such a, like the first time I realized zines weren't forever. I was like, I got when I was young, got like an issue of Triple X.
Oh,
and I was like, oh, and shout out to Gitter. Yeah, love you, dude. You're awesome. But like, I was like, oh, I wonder when the next issue. And the person, I was like an older person, was like, this thing doesn't exist anymore. I'm like, oh, what?
Right. What?
Like, this isn't like Time Magazine. Like,
totally.
Thought this was a thing. And you get into it and you're like, oh, like zines are so finite and people are doing these interviews and I have no idea who these are. People in these reviews. It's like, it's such a special thing, especially that medium of talking about someone else's art and critiquing it.
Yep.
And drawing attention to it for either a good result or a poor result, but then also interviewing people. I just find it fascinating. I never had that bug to do it. Like I did a little bit of reviews for people and I slightly tried my hand at interviewing, but frankly, it was too much work. Like it was just way too much work. And that's why I'm always so fascinated with people who before podcasting were so willing to be in that space. Cause it's like a ton of work. And also people can shit on you. Like they can be upset with how you did an interview or if you gave them a bad review, it can have consequences.
Absolutely.
And so like when you name those people, it's like, yeah, but then like think of the like 5,000 other people who we have no idea who they are.
And in the connective tissue that I feel with that too, like this, it's so random, but there's this, there's a zine done in the eastern on Greater Ontario area of Canada on the banks of the Tumid River. And this is just goes to how stupid our brains are, where you can remember these things. Honestly, he put out maybe 2 or 3 issues. I'm almost positive this dude is not involved with like
What's it
Heart.
called?
So the name of the zine is On the Banks of the Tumid River.
Oh, that's the actual name.
That's the literal name.
Okay.
Yeah. So he put out, probably like 2 or 3 issues. But the thing that I felt so connected with that zine and many others, to your point, that just completely left aside, they were injecting some of their personality into it. So whether it was like, just like personal writing, and like some of it could obviously be completely cringeworthy, where you're just like, oh, like this is obviously, a live journal that should have obviously been kept, locked up. So I felt like that was also a really interesting component that, was able to influence me, whether I could, describe that as an influence or not. And like Chris Callahan as another example. I always was like, anything he wrote for any zine ever, or obviously any of his bands, I was just like hanging on every single word. I'm like, I am diametrically opposed to many of your beliefs, but I love every word you're saying. And like bringing that part of your person. I mean, Chris was an example of like, he's bringing his whole person in here. The other zine that I'm talking about was like, snippets of that. But I just felt like, again, getting to know these people, whatever medium they were using to express themselves, not only helped me connect further, but then I was like, okay, there is something that I can do, whether a person finds. I love when people, find out about me via my podcast and are just like, oh, I didn't know you sang in a band, or like, oh, you sang in the band. Like, I didn't even know that you're doing a podcast or whatever. And like all those connection points when you're putting yourself out there is really important, because I think that whether you're known as a front person for a band or whether you're known as a professional business human being, like all of these things you're putting out there, you never know how they're going to return and potentially, obviously, influence others. Not like that's like a core tenet of what it is that we're doing. That's just an added benefit of us putting ourselves out there in so many different capacities.